It was a sweltering afternoon in the village of Mbengwi, located in the lush hills of northwest Cameroon. The dry season was in full force, and the dusty red earth crunched underfoot. Mamana Nji was making her way home after working the fields all day, a heavy basket of vegetables balanced on her head. As she approached her modest hut, something caught her eye in the distance. A massive figure was slowly lumbering over the far ridge towards the village. At first, she thought her eyes were playing tricks in the shimmering heat haze. But as the colossal shape grew nearer, dread gripped her heart. It was a giant, a towering, muscular brute at least 50 feet tall. His scowling face was twisted into a sneer of disdain as he took earth-shaking strides across the countryside, flattening trees and crushing boulders to pebbles underfoot. Mamana froze, paralyzed by terror. All she could do was watch in horror as the gargantuan monster approached Mbengwi, letting out a bone-chilling roar that echoed across the valley. The few villagers who were still out working immediately fled in panic at the thunderous sound. The giant stopped just outside the village, glowering down at the small huts with beady black eyes. In a voice that shook the ground, he bellowed in the local dialect, "People of Mbengwi, I am the mighty Ngakan, lord of these lands. You have displeased me by denying the sacrifices I am owed. As punishment, I demand that you surrender every young maiden in the village to be my wives. Refuse, and I shall crush your pathetic homes into dust." Mamana's blood turned to ice in her veins. The stories of the ancient giants who once ruled these hills were more than just myths and legends after all. And this one, Ngakan, was staking his vile claim on the young women of Mbengwi in the most horrific way. She sprinted home, flinging open the door to find her daughter Malala tending to the cooking fire. "Malala, a giant has come! We must flee at once!" she cried urgently. But before they could make a move, Ngakan's colossal hand smashed through the roof, scattering thatch and beams everywhere. His enormous fingers wrapped around Malala's slender form and plucked her up like a doll, despite her terrified screams. "No, leave my daughter alone, you monster," Mamana sobbed, clawing futilely at the giant's impenetrable skin. Ngakan merely chuckled, a rumbling like distant thunder. "Quiet, wretch. This lovely flower will make a fine addition to my collection." He callously tossed Malala into a rough sack slung over his immense shoulders, already containing several other shrieking girls he had kidnapped. Over the next few hours, Ngakan systematically ravaged every hut, seizing every young woman he could find in the village, no matter how they pleaded or struggled. Their anguished families were powerless to stop him as he gathered his repulsive new brides. When his rampage was complete and his sack bulged with captives, Ngakan let out an earth-shaking roar of triumph. "You had your chance to obey, foolish mortals. Now you shall learn the price of defying Ngakan." The helpless villagers watched in heartbroken horror as the giant turned and lumbered back towards the mountains from where he came, their daughters and sisters desperately crying for help from within the coarse sack bouncing on his shoulders. As night fell, the men of Mbengwi banded together, consumed by rage, grief, and shame at their inability to protect their loved ones. Rame, a grizzled elder and former hunter, took charge of the search party. "We cannot allow this abomination to escape with our daughters," he growled. "We few may be small, but we are resourceful and driven by the fire of vengeance. We will track this Ngakan and rescue our girls, no matter how powerful a monster he may be." Under Rame's leadership, the group of a few dozen village men followed the giant's footprints and the sounds of their captured women's muffled sobs. They trekked through the night, up into the treacherous mountain ranges that loomed over the village. As the sun began to rise, they finally caught up to the lumbering giant at the foot of a craggy peak. There, Ngakan had made camp next to a shallow cave, starting a fire and stringing up the captive maidens like cuts of meat hung to dry. "We'll never be able to overpower that monster head-on," Rame murmured grimly, watching as Ngakan casually shredded a tree into firewood with his bare hands. "But we are many, and he is alone. We will use guile to bring him down." Under cover of darkness, the men split into two groups. One would create a distraction and lead Ngakan away from his camp, hopefully far enough for the other team to attempt a rescue of the maidens before the enraged giant could return. Rami took the larger group and they silently crept through the night to the opposite side of Ngakan's primitive camp, lying in wait as the other men began banging pots and drums, shouting taunts at the giant. "Hey, ugly lump of filth! Is that all the women you could grasp in those slimy paws?" "Probably because you reek worse than a wet dog!" Ngakan awoke with an outraged roar, stomping around searching for the source of the jeering. His callous cruelty was matched only by his boundless arrogance and hubris. "You dare mock Ngakan, Lord of the Mountains? I shall grind your frail bones to dust, insects!" He stomped off in pursuit of the loud voices, crushing trees and boulders along the way. As soon as he was out of sight, Raim signaled his team to move in swiftly and stealthily. Racing against the clock, they hurried to cut down the wailing, terrified maidens as gently as possible. "Do not make a sound," Remy cautioned them in urgent whispers. "We must make our escape before that beast returns." Working quickly but carefully, the rescuers managed to get all the girls untied. They fled the camp in the opposite direction that Ngakan had wandered, praying their distraction would buy them enough time. Just as they reached the cover of the forest with their loved ones, they heard Ngakan's furious roar of realization echoing across the mountains behind them. "My wives! You thieves! You'll pay for this insolence!" The ground shook violently as the gargantuan footsteps charged after them with astonishing speed. Despite their head start, the giant's relentless pursuit rapidly closed the gap. "Into the caves! Hurry!" Raimi shouted as they reached a gaping maw in the rocky mountain face, scrambling inside as fast as they could. The entrance was too small for the colossal Ngakan, but he thrust his meaty arm deep into the opening, clawing and groping in a desperate attempt to snatch back his prisoners. His raging roars and threats shook the very cavern around them. "Return what is mine and submit, you wretched insects, or I shall bury you alive in this pitiful hole." Raimi and his men took up whatever sturdy branches and rocks they could find from the cave floor, then began battering Ngakan's grasping arm in a furious, coordinated attack. With their combined desperation and weight of numbers against his single vulnerable limb, the villagers gradually managed to batter the mighty giant into howling agony and retreat. As he pulled back, clutching his bleeding, broken arm, Raim took a burning branch from their meager fire pit, then charged out of the cave mouth. Staring down the path of the giant's inevitable return with a spear in hand and flames licking at his feet, Rami shouted up at Ngakan with all the ferocity and courage he could muster. "That's just a taste of what you have earned with your vile cruelty, monster. We would sooner die to the last man than surrender our women to your grasp. Leave these lands, or we will make you suffer as you have made us suffer." Ngakan seemed taken aback by the old hunter's audacity, despite his tremendous advantage in size and strength. A flicker of uncertainty passed over his cruel features as he cradled his mangled arm. With an incoherent roar of rage and hatred, the giant turned and fled back over the mountains from where he came, shaking the earth with every thunderous stride and leaving a trail of bloody footprints behind. The villagers erupted in raucous cheers at having driven off their monstrous tormentor, but there were also many tears of relief and sorrow as they welcomed their rescued loved ones into their embraces once more. As morning light crept over the peaks and into their cavern refuge, the full toll of Ngakan's vicious attack became clear. Several of the maidens had succumbed to injuries, never to see their village or families again. Those who survived were battered, malnourished, and deeply traumatized. But at least, for now, Mbengwi was safe. The elders vowed to implement stronger defenses and reinforce the ancient traditions and rituals in the hopes of preventing such an attack from ever happening again. As for Ngakan, whether the bloodied giant made good on his threats to return or simply died of his wounds alone in the wilderness, none could say for sure. But for generations, parents would caution their children with the tale of the brutal giant who tried to steal Mbengwi's maidens as brides. And the people would forever remain vigilant, watchful for any sign of the horrific Ngakan's return to darken their lands once more.